Hello, and welcome to our virtual event, The Future of AI Governance, here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thanks for joining us today, where we will be discussing ongoing efforts by policymakers to grapple with AI and AI governance and possible next steps on the topic. I'm joined by some really exciting top experts. These are the folks that were in Congress considering these issues, writing some of the benchmark documents that we'll discuss today, leading top advisory committees on the topic, and testifying in front of Congress and lawmakers as recently as this week on regulatory proposals. So some of these, all these panelists include Ryan Costello, who was a former representative of the U.S. House of Representatives, Sorrel Friedler, who is associate professor of computer science from Harvard College, Rob Strayer, who's executive vice president of the policy at the Information Technology Industry Council, and Miriam Vogel, who's president and CEO of Equal AI. Here at BBC, we hope to foster an honest and detailed conversation on this topic. As audience participants, please be sure to submit your questions via the chat function on YouTube. You can also do it from hashtag BBC Live on Twitter. And we will reserve some time at the end to get to as many as we can and address them as best we can. It'd be helpful if you have a specific question for one of the panelists, just go ahead and say so in your question. Over the course of the event, we're going to cover seven top-level questions aimed at kind of four core broad areas, which are, current events, our current efforts to govern AI, including in the federal government. How do we address risk and mediate it? Potential lessons from abroad in terms of AI regulations, and how governance of AI specifically could impact some of the other technology policy areas that are ongoing in Congress. And so with that, I really want to turn it over to our panelists because they're the experts in the room. So I'm going to start with one just for all four of them. And that is, what are your thoughts on how Schumer, Biden, and some of the agencies are responding to the latest push for AI regulations? And where do you see some of these efforts going? And I'll start with Miriam.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's really great to be with you. I always love your discussions and this audience. I look forward to the questions because I know how thoughtful and engaging they are. So, I think it's an exciting time. At Equal AI, we've been doing this work for 5 years. And like I'm sure most of you feel, everyone now understands what we've been talking about, that there's a need to talk about what is responsible AI, what is our expectation, what shall we be doing to govern this appropriately and make sure that it benefits everybody in a fair and equitable way. So it's been really a great relief to see the White House step in. You can talk about whether the voluntary commitments were enough, but they were a step forward. And I'm sure Sorrel will tell us, moving something forward in the White House, after 2 tours, I can tell you that is no small lift. And so I think that is a very positive sign that we've seen the White House speaking on this with the Bill of Rights, through the Commerce NIST framework, and through the voluntary commitments. And we're seeing this steady cadence. On the Hill yesterday and with many hearings, we've seen that they're really trying to get smart. They're taking their job seriously. And I think that is something we can be grateful for. That's something that is hopeful. It's not enough, obviously. We need to get to clarity and we need to get to safety. And we need to make sure that we align on what the expectations are so that people can feel safe with the AI that they're using, whether they know it or not. So I think some of the biggest challenges ahead are moving the conversations to actions, and specifically even defining what are the risks that we're going to address first. I think that's not a small or easy question to answer, as all of you know. And then what levers do we have? Do we have sufficient levers to answer that? Do we need new infrastructure and frameworks, or can we make do with the systems we have in place?
Thank you so much. And, I think brings up some really good points. And you mentioned Sorrel. Sorrel, in your bio, you've worked with the OSTP on some of these documents. I'd love to hear your answer on this.
Yeah, it's good to be with you all and have this important conversation. So as you mentioned, I was recently in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where I worked on the White House AI Bill of Rights. I've also been a researcher working on responsible AI for about a decade. And, I think that the White House AI Bill of Rights and a lot of this other work has really been trying to focus on the way that people can potentially be harmed by these technologies, but also the concrete steps that we can take to try to prevent those harms, right? And to really benefit from the possibilities of the tech. And I'm excited that the White House and the administration broadly has been moving forward in that direction. And it's also been great to see Schumer and other members of Congress start to really take these issues seriously, right? And of course, we'll see what happens next throughout the fall and, where we get on all of these things. But, I think that's the really key thing from my perspective, is to take those harms seriously and to think concretely about what we can do to try to prevent them.
Makes an excellent point. And, you mentioned what Schumer's doing and what they're doing over the next couple of months in the fall with the insight forums that are coming up and trying to get smart on AI, taking a measured approach. So I'd love to hear, Ryan, as a former representative in Congress, what are your thoughts?
Sure, and thanks for allowing me to be part of this panel. If I was in Congress right now, and I'm a Republican, I'd feel very comfortable saying that the approach by the administration in the issuance of AI guidelines is the right first step. I also think that the Senate Majority Leader has gone about this the right way, garnering respected members on both sides of the aisle. And I'll just use a couple quotes that the Majority Leader mentioned just yesterday. We have to listen and learn. We have to not be too specific before we get all the facts. And if you go too fast, too soon, you could ruin things. And when you look at what the chamber just put out today, report to Congress on current laws and regulations, promote AI research, R&D in complementary emerging technologies, inventory of authorities to combat fraud, look at our educational guidelines at K through 12 level, maintain our talent pool, and clearly the Patent and Trademark Office is going to be viewing things and dealing with a complicated set of issues moving forward, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And so developing a baseline of what the potential uses and the potential risks are is a responsible way to develop a framework. There's going to be a lot of specific policies in a lot of specific areas. And I'm sure part of our discussion today will talk about, AI in the healthcare space may be different than AI in the educational space, and AI in national defense, and AI in environmental laws and compliance. And if we jump too soon, or we get too prescriptive or too broad in our policy orientation, it's likely that we're going to be regulating things that should be regulated differently, or we won't be touching upon things that we need to touch upon. And that requires a real precise instrument. It requires a degree of sophistication, but more than anything else, it requires a common baseline of understanding by policymakers and an acknowledgement that you cannot do this on a partisan basis. We can argue, we can have debates over tax policy. Frankly, we can have debates over certain elements of privacy, the right to privacy. But when it comes to what the AI applications are in the real world, and it doesn't end at our borders, I think it's very critical that we get a shared understanding of what the capabilities are, as well as what we need to prevent, as well as what we need to promote from an innovation perspective. So I think it's been a very promising first few steps by the administration and by Congress in not doing too much, but also highlighting the need to really focus on a lot of the issue sets that arise from artificial intelligence.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. And that's, so from what I'm hearing is it's been measured, it's been great. Let's not try to regulate across different sectors, but potentially, sector-specific regulation moving forward. And you mentioned the need for education. Rob, I'd love to get your thoughts. You were in front of Congress this week, talking to them, trying to educate them on some of these issues.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Thanks to you and to BPC for bringing us together today. Just by way of background, I lead the global policy team at ITI, which is the Information Technology Industry Council. We represent the 80 largest technology companies that are from all sectors of technology. So that includes both those developing models and companies that are going to be deploying those applications in the field. So I testified on Tuesday. We're very encouraged by the amount of effort that Congress is putting into the education process. There was one tweak I would have, is that as there's these listening sessions occurring, they should be more transparent and public. I think just as we should have transparency in AI, it's important that the Congress function in a transparent way so that the public knows exactly what's going on in these listening sessions. One thing I want to highlight on the administration side is really impressive work that the National Institute of Standards and Technology has done to create an AI risk management framework that had the input of the private sector and civil society. And that took more than a year to do for them to produce their first version in January of this year. That's going to be improved over time, new risk profiles inserted into it. But that's a really productive way that private sector, civil society, and the government are coming together to manage risk with regard to AI systems. So just wanted to highlight that as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The way NIST went about getting public comments on those things and incorporating those public comments in a very thoughtful way into some of those draft documents, and then finally the final version of the risk management framework, it's really a testament to their staff and their leadership over there on, engaging the public and understanding it and trying to get as many folks, stakeholders engaged as possible. And I'm curious, Sorel, following up with your work that you did at OSTP and the blueprint, how much did the risk management framework play into that, or is there any kind of overlap there?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things I have to say on that. So first, just in terms of timeline, they were being developed at the same time. So while much was happening behind the scenes to coordinate that sort of, public interplay, may have been less obvious. I think, similarly, we went through a pretty similar process for the AI Bill of Rights with, a year of meetings with all sorts of stakeholders that's sort of detailed in the appendix to the document. And I think that I see these two documents as really complementary. So the AI risk management framework from NIST is really trying to lay out a framework for identifying and managing all types of risks, right? And it's quite clear in the document that they don't prescribe risk thresholds. So it's sort of saying to you as a company or the government or whatever organization is looking at these risks, you have to decide for yourself what risks you're really concerned about, how concerned you are about them, and what steps that means you should take. The AI Bill of Rights is much more focused, as makes sense for a government document, on values and rights, and thinking about, what are those settings where we really do need to protect people. And so as you'll see in the document, it lays out a specific set of types of interactions with AI and types of impacts from AI that the document's really focused on, right? Those are impacts to people's rights, to their opportunities, or the access to critical services. And so in those cases, in these, really critically important cases to our democracy and to our communities, then those rights need to be protected. And so it then lays out, we can think about this as sort of a higher risk category, right? Using the NIST language. It then lays out sort of appropriate risk tolerances and things that should be done to try to mitigate those risks. So yeah, I see them as very, very complementary, and, of course, really respect the work that Ilham and the team at NIST did. Yeah,
for sure. So going into something that we've kind of all mentioned, which was risk in AI. I'm just curious, everyone's thoughts on what are the biggest risks that we have that AI poses today. You get a whole gambit from kind of the AI doomers to the new printing press, kind of different ideas around that. So I'll start with Ryan this time around. What do you see as the biggest risks?
So I'll tell you what I think the biggest risk is. The biggest risk is that an unforeseen risk comes along, or a known risk is out there for which we have not developed a responsible governance framework to respond to. That could be in the criminal code from a fraud perspective. It could be a national security issue. It could be a drug development issue. AI will reveal itself in so many different iterations of our society. And you have a committee by committee structure in the House and the Senate that, from a jurisdictional perspective, is going to have to deal with different parts of AI. And if you allow someone to innovate in either an evil way through an evil actor or unwittingly so, and it gets in the wrong hands, and you don't have the authority as a governmental agency to respond, I think it becomes extremely difficult to figure out how to respond. And so the risk is that we don't identify how to respond to any individual risk, if that makes sense. I think that's, to me, the biggest question mark over how you develop a governance framework. And the absence of a governance framework, right, in many ways invites those to, there's that disruptive tech statement like, let's break stuff and worry about the aftermath later, or, let's build stuff and, let me do what I want. You can find me later. This is a different type of technology, and the capabilities here are, I think, much grander than any previous technology. And that's where I think government needs to make sure that we're out ahead of it.
Yeah. That's an important point. I've heard it phrased a couple of times, like move fast and break stuff is one area that they talk about. And then another one where we talk about in terms of permissionless innovation as a kind of way to frame how we've done the tech regulation in the past. But, I want to kick it over to Miriam. You did a little bit of work. You've been working in this space for quite some time. And so you've been able to identify these risks over multiple years, even in this latest iteration of kind of the AI focus. What are your biggest concerns?
So I fully agree. The unintended and unforeseen consequences is for sure a risk. But I would love to respectfully push back on the question, because I think it's hard to say what is the greatest risk. I come to this work, my bias is as having worked as a lawyer, having worked in policies to reduce bias and discrimination at the White House and the Justice Department. And so I'm very familiar with individuals impacted. And the existential risks to humanity, we should be thinking about for sure. We should be taking action for sure. On the other hand, if people, communities are being ignored and not given opportunities for jobs, for housing, due to errors in data or the algorithm, that's impacting people's opportunities, their livelihoods, their ability to thrive and care for their family. And then if you're talking about life and death, before we get to the large language model questions and the frontier model debates, you still have the narrow AI, the traditional AI that's on the market and at wide scale use. What if in healthcare, someone's getting a false negative on their cancer screening because they were not part of the overrepresented population in the data sets, or they were not calibrated for in the algorithm for the query that for which the algorithm was designed to have a high success rate. So I hear you. It's important that we define which risks we want to take on as the preeminent so that we can move forward. We can't just debate what those risks are, but I would say we have to have two paths forward. We have to be thinking about the rules of the road, establishing, what are the seatbelts, what are the speed limits. Some of them need to be nationally and federally standardized, like a seatbelt. Some of them can be more localized, like speed limits, depending on what that is, and move in parallel tracks to make sure that people are not harmed, people trust AI, and that it deserves our trust.
So if I can just ask you real quick to define something that maybe some of our audience members might not know the definition here. You mentioned frontier versus and then foundational AI systems. Can you quickly kind of just explain that a little bit?
Certainly, to the best of my ability. I don't know that we have a standardized, I think there's another area. I don't even know that we have a universal definition of AI yet, but I'm glad we're not spending time debating that at this point because we need to move forward. But in general, anyone who's using ChatGPT, anyone who has enjoyed Google Bard, they've used a large language model, and that has taken us from narrow AI is one of the ways to frame what we've been using to date, where it's an algorithm curated on a limited data set to these new models where they've opened up the gates on the amount of data from which it's trained. So a very civilian interpretation of what it is being trained on all the data on the web, essentially, so that the data sets are not narrow, and as a result, it has been able to train itself, as opposed to traditional AI, which is limited to the taskings and understandings. Understanding I use in quotes because I think you can debate whether it's really understanding, but it's able to extrapolate beyond what it has been taught and teach itself new definitions, new understandings, and new capabilities.
Thank you for explaining that. And I'll keep pushing. Anytime there's like an acronym named or anything like that, please feel free to spell it out for folks, because DC, sometimes it feels like we're speaking our own language here. So Rob, I'd love to get your thoughts. You know, I know we've talked a little bit in the past about, you know, cybersecurity and national security. Is that a concern for you?
Well, in some ways, I'll get to that in just a minute. I think that I'm confident that we're going to have the right kind of policy interactions between the private sector, civil society, and US government to get this right. I think the blind spot we got to be really careful about is that we forget about somehow the global competitive context that this is fitting into. US right now is leading in AI. We have the best innovation at the model level and at the application level, but there'll be new generations, there'll be new large language models that go well beyond the kind of the surprise that the public felt with ChatGPT. And so we need to be leading innovation in the future. And so we need a pro-innovation framework for policy that also manages risk. And I think there's just two major components to that. One is focusing on the innovation investment side, and also then focusing on public trust and accountability. We're going to get that right, but it's important that we lead innovation because it's going to give us the best tools to defend our IT networks from a cybersecurity perspective. And it's also going to give our national security capabilities in the military and intelligence community the best thing they need to outcompete their adversaries globally. So our future very much depends on staying in the lead for AI, especially as it transforms every sector of the economy. I mean, there's estimates that it's going to generate $25 trillion of economic benefit globally. So the leaders in those markets are going to be the ones, the companies, and those countries that have those companies are going to be ones who accrue the lion's share of those benefits. And in the tech sector, it's not uncommon for companies to spend 40% of their revenues back on R&D for the next cycle. So you really need to keep moving forward for the next generation. And I would just say that public trust is really important, not just for individual rights, but to think about public trust is important because it's going to increase adoption and accelerate the development of the AI ecosystem in the United States. So these steps are really important, that the public continues to gain trust in the technology over time, and they're not reluctant to use it, but they seek it and seek its benefits. And that'll have a flywheel impact on all aspects of our economy over time.
For sure. And I think that's a really important point to say, you know, we can lead in this space, and we'll get to some lessons potentially learned from the European Union and their efforts to regulate AI. Just for awareness on the panelists, we are starting to get a lot of a couple of questions in, so I'll start peppering them in as we get them. But I want to get to Sorel in this question before we start that. So Sorel, what are your thoughts on risk?
Yeah, thanks. You know, I want to push back a little bit on the idea that we should be focused on sort of the hypothetical future unknown. I think that's important, but I think that the most important problem right now is trying to help people who are currently experiencing actual harms from these systems, right? So that's people who are being screened out from job opportunities, potentially by some sort of discriminatory algorithm, right? It's people who are being incorrectly denied their government benefits because of some incorrectly operating fraud detection algorithm, right? These are people who are experiencing real world harms right now, right? Not in some hypothetical future. I also think that by putting in place the guardrails that we need in order to help people now, we also get the benefits of creating a governance structure that could help us with that hypothetical future, whether or not it comes to pass, right? So I think it's really important to keep focusing on people who are being harmed by these systems now, right? And what we can do, right, to Rob's recent point about, thinking broadly about innovation in this space. I also think that provides a great opportunity for innovation, for interesting new companies, right? Miriam has spoken a little bit to this, for interesting new companies to think about how they can introduce new tools that will allow the public to understand what's going on behind the scenes in AI, that will help to create less discriminatory decisions, and that can really show what it means to have a US vision of AI, right, that's based in democratic values and that really actually lives up to those.
That's a really good point. And we hear this quite often. I think Senator Young was talking about this yesterday after some of the hearings where he said, we want to lead AI, but we want to make sure it has American values and if it's instilled in there. And so, I really like the point of it's having some guardrails in place. I think based off of our research at BPC, there's a lot of guessing that's happening around the impact because it hasn't happened in a big scale. It's starting to happen. And so having this idea of, mediating the hypothetical risks is somewhat of a fallacy. But what we can do is start building out the social safety nets that we know are going to be needed to mediate some of the disruption long term. And that can be done through training programs, Pell Grants, short-term Pell Grants, things like that, lifelong learning accounts. So very concrete measures to account for the future disruption or the current disruption, like you said, Sorel. And getting to one of the questions here for Miriam, actually, on some of the very specific use cases that you mentioned. Do you see, and this is from one of our audience members, a future where the entire legal system removes human judges and attorneys altogether?
Removes human judges. I hope not. I think there's a great partnership there where thoughtful AI can support decisions. I think, some of these dockets are terribly heavy and adding some consistency can be helpful. But, we have to make sure that these AI systems are useful. For whom were they trained? And as I'm always channeling Kathy O'Neill whenever I can, for whom could this fail? Well, we've seen in the criminal justice system some of the worst use cases of AI where they have completely failed the people whom they were supposed to be benefiting in society, whether it was in sentencing use of AI or identifying areas to invest police resources. So I think that particularly if you're talking about the justice space where you're talking about people's freedom and liberty and basic constitutional rights, I would argue that's an area where you would always need humans in the loop. Humans make mistakes too, but I think the two together, if trained appropriately and understanding where these biases and potential risks, including discrimination, lie, they can be a powerful, united system.
For sure. And we've got a couple more questions, but I'm going to hold them to the end because that one was just specific on your response there. But, I want to get into kind of what we talked about a little bit on, making sure that whatever we put into place reflects our American values. But European Union is also starting to regulate on this. So this is, again, for everybody. What do you think about the EU's approach? And is there a path for the U.S. to learn from them, and potentially what would you do differently? I actually am very curious if I can add on, Ryan, based off of your time in Congress, how much did some of those kind of regulatory frameworks impact your thinking as you were thinking through some of these legislative and regulatory questions?
Well, I'll answer that a little bit more macro than your question, and that is to say how other countries or jurisdictions handle policymaking does not factor into the consideration of U.S. policymakers enough. And you can look at the GDPR, which is the EU privacy framework. And frankly, we can even look, by the way, internally, right, at the California privacy law. And I think a real challenge for us is we don't want to move too fast, but if you move too slow, you're going to have competing jurisdictions and you're going to have an international patchwork on a technology that is global in its application, with a sense of immediacy around its ability to impact events and activities and transactions. And so ideally, we as a U.S. government will respond in a manner that aligns and is consistent with what the EU is doing, and maybe hopefully improves upon it. Because another thing that I wish I would have said in your first question about risk, and was mentioned a little bit earlier, is for as much as we want to look at this as a competitiveness issue, and we want the US to develop a policy framework that provides economic opportunity for those who live within our borders, there is also a US national interest in making sure that the geopolitical balance of power and geopolitical stability is not threatened by nation states who decide not to follow any AI laws that we pass or that the EU may pass. You know, we have countries right now who are using nuclear weapons and are using their energy resources in a way to dramatically shift balance of power considerations, notwithstanding the fact that their GDP or their military is nothing compared to ours. And so we as a nation state have to really also, and I don't want to overstate this, but I also don't want to understate it, we have to make sure that we as a country are looking out for the good of the whole internationally. Elsewise, you're going to have some bad foreign actors get a hold or discover or utilize technologies in a way that could be significantly damaging, and that's regardless of whether the EU has a better policy than the US or not. There has to be some sort of global framework that ultimately comes from this in order to have that enforceability mechanism.
Yeah. And you hear quite often some of the conversations on, you know, how do you limit the impact here, and potentially, and the conversation tends to go, oh, open source versus regulation, or potentially the China model where they're thinking about licensing some of these AI programs and systems. But Sorel, I want to get your opinion on this. You know, did the European Union's efforts factor into any of your work, ongoing considerations?
So one of the things that is, you know, I think really challenging for the EU is that they have, because of their governance structure, they don't really have the same opportunity that we do in the US to create a centralized regulation, even for a specific domain of AI, right? So, you know, HHS is considering various regulations that have to do with algorithms used in clinical decision making, right? And that becomes nationwide. And the same thing would happen if FTC were going to consider something, right? But because of their sort of structure with EU member states, they don't have that opportunity. And, you know, I think that makes it very hard. I feel for them over there trying to figure out how to do this, to try to avoid that sort of patchwork of policies that Ryan was pointing to, because I do see how that's going to be, you know, pretty hard for companies to navigate. On the other hand, I think that we have the opportunity to really lead, right, by putting in place nationwide regulation from our existing federal agencies, or, you know, depending on what Congress gets up to, potentially new federal agencies that can provide that sort of consistency across all of the states. And I absolutely think that's what we should move towards.
And thank you. And you know, that's an interesting point that I think we're starting to hear some murmurs around, like, is there a need for an independent agency or, you know, authorities there? We're not going to potentially dive in on that right now, but that is a very interesting question that we've heard about from especially this week. But I want to get, you know, Rob's thoughts on this. You know, working with ITI and some of the biggest tech companies, you know, you have to deal with these compliance issues across the pond and things like that. And so you have firsthand experience on some of the impact. What do you think of the European Union's efforts in this area?
Yeah, and part of my answer here is going to be informed by my 3 years at the State Department, where I was the lead diplomat talking to the Europeans and others about our policy in the United States and negotiating tech agreements with them. I think there's really two major weaknesses in the current EU AI Act. The first is that while it was originally proposed in April 2021 as something that was risk-based, it's lost a lot of that risk-based nature because so many new sectors have been lumped into their high-risk category. And that means that lower risk uses like predictive text in some cases or other uses that don't affect humans at all could be swept into a heavier regulatory framework. There's still negotiation ongoing, and hopefully they can get it back to something that's a little more risk focused. But right now, things like foundation models have a very heavy burden of requirements placed on them. They're essentially all foundation models be treated as high risk. So that's something that, foundation models are what deployers of AI use cases in all kinds of settings, whether it's speech to text or just simple flags in your on your iPhone that say I'm in a certain location. Do you want to use this app? It'll catch a lot of things that it shouldn't. Those foundation models. The second big concern with the AI Act is on this conformity side, conformity assessment. So anything that's high risk in their categories needs to meet a set of standards that are yet to be developed and have conformity assessment by a third party for those. And those standards are still under development. There's something called the International Standards Organization's Joint Technical Committee that has a subcommittee 42 that's developing standards. They have a risk management standard. There's other standards that can be these benchmarks still underway. Separately, the Europeans are trying to develop a whole separate set of standards. They're probably 3 to 5 years behind this other international framework. So when the EU Act is finished, likely at the end of this year, there's 2 years before it goes into effect. During that 2 years, there'll be a mad scramble to put together these standards that all companies will need to meet. And that's going to make it very difficult for companies to anticipate what's actually going to happen. There might be cases where the EU decides that since they don't have a standard, they're just going to draw up their own specifications, which could be really problematic, fragmenting how companies interact with the EU. They'll have to meet one set of specifications there versus the rest of the world. We much prefer the approaches that we've seen in Japan, Singapore, and the United Kingdom in their strategies for AI, which are very specific to use cases and focused on risk, and also focused on collaborating with the private sector to generate this trustworthiness.
So let me ask you a follow-up question, Rob, if that's okay. Is there a diffusion effect? We talk a little bit about the Brussels effect in regulatory apparatuses where, things that get regulated in Europe, it doesn't make sense to potentially have two different products. And so you create one product that's compliant in Europe and the United States and worldwide. And generally speaking, that's a very simplistic way of saying that's the Brussels effect of their regulation diffusing across different nation states. Do you see, you mentioned Singapore, Japan, Korea, do you see any considerations happening around the international level in terms of diffusing across different nation states around AI or technology in general?
Well, really important first step in that process of international collaboration was in 2019 at the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where they agreed to a set of principles for AI. The subsequent presidencies of the G7, now with the Japanese, have been focusing on AI. So the Japanese are going to move this to another step forward by the fall, I think, on common practices related to AI. So I think that's where we can see some harmonization or at least interoperability about the way to approach artificial intelligence. And the EU is part of the G7 discussions. They're always invited. They're now a formal member, actually. So I think that's a very productive way we can see progress, both at the OECD continuing and at the G7.
Great. And Miriam, what are your thoughts on kind of the European Union's approach to this?
I think, good on them for trying to move forward. I think it's ambitious, it's challenging. I think there's a lot to be said for trying to be the first mover in this space. I think, the more recent efforts to get international cooperation are very well founded. I think, in general, you want to have buy-in on these really important standards, and especially here when you need the perspectives of numerous stakeholders. If you're going to be designating the regulations that everyone's going to be following, you need to make sure that what it would be the downstream impacts on different countries, what would be the impacts on those currently leading in the space, as well as those who aspire to aim to lead in this space. What's the small business effect? How does civil society indicate whether this is useful or problematic. So I think the efforts that they've undertaken to make sure that there's more international participation and feedback is very well founded.
So this kind of bleeds into the next question. I'll keep it with you, Miriam. That I have a question on kind of addressing some of these regulations and this idea between soft law and hard law, where essentially soft law is where you have this these issues that maybe the market will drive a solution to, and there's no hard law in place, but there's kind of this idea of best practices or standards, versus hard law where that's codified into regulation. And I'm just curious onto your thoughts of where do you see the federal AI governance legislation going? Do you agree with the trends, and do you think that soft law and hard law have a kind of a role to play on this?
Yes, and I think given the technologies we're dealing with here, I think you need soft law, you need hard law, you need internal regulation. And I don't think it can be any one of the above. It has to be all of the above. I think I think there need to be designated best practices. We talked at the beginning about there was a comment about whether it should be industry specific regulation. To some extent, we need some general consensus. And as I just mentioned, it can't just be a US decision. It needs to have international buy-in. As we all know, AI has no borders, no boundaries, and we have to have similar mindset when we're thinking about how it's going to be regulated, how we're going to build trust by users across the world, and how we test the systems to ensure that we have those trusts. So fortunately, we do have laws on the books that regulate some of these pieces, the civil rights laws. And we've been fortunate in the US that some of the regulators in this space have been quite vocal and made joint historic statements. The EEOC had an initiative, as we all know, 3-4 years ago on the AI space, where they're looking at how it's impacting people's ability to get hired and within their workspace to make sure that they're treated fairly and not in violation of their civil rights protections. Then we saw a joint historic statement between the DOJ and the EEOC. I realize I'm talking in acronyms. My apologies. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was followed more recently this spring with another joint statement, again, historic, unprecedented, between the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and again, the EEOC, to remind people, you're buying, you're building, you're deploying AI systems now. And we actually have laws on the books that whether it's an AI that has made a determination or recommendation or a human, civil rights still apply. People still have these American values in this case. So I think there's significant efforts underway in governments across the world, but particularly within the U.S., I think we've all seen really important developments, as well as what we've talked about, the efforts underway on the Hill and some of the important White House announcements and the Department of Commerce framework, which I really don't think we can say enough about, and the Bill of Rights, which I think of as kind of like a gut check for us on for whom could this fail. But fortunately, the regulatory agencies are also giving us guidance that we need new regulations. Well, they're not saying this part. We'll all agree. We need some international standardization. We need some clarity. AI systems are being built. We can't wait 5 years for what the best practices are for documentation, for testing, for red teaming, for these really important measures. But in the meantime, there are many laws on the books. We have a paper coming out shortly where we do just a brief top line survey on some of the laws that do affect AI and that lawyers and their clients should be very mindful of today.
That's a really good point. I mean, the idea of regulatory agencies, essentially coming to terms with what they need to regulate in this space. I think a really good example is the FEC just came out with like a request for comment on whether or not they have the authority or rulemaking around deep fakes in elections. And as we know, that's something that is right around the corner to 2024. It feels like we're already in a presidential campaign. And this idea of how does this play in terms of widely available deepfakes in the electoral cycle, and whether the FCC has the rulemaking ability to make sure that those are labeled And then on the other side, you have Congress introducing bills to actually explicitly label these things, so provide that authority if it doesn't exist. But I want to kick it over to Ryan a little bit in terms of this idea of soft law versus hard law in some of these examples. How did you think about this when you were a representative? What role does industry have in terms of best practices and standards around some of these areas?
First, I agree with what Miriam said on the issue of it's hard and soft. It's regulatory, it's codified, it's best practices. And it strikes me that, we are being asked as those in the policymaking ecosystem, for the past couple centuries, we've been designing a framework of governance around human activity. And now we're going to be asked to do something on some level, to some extent, to provide a governance structure to like machines. Not necessarily thinking on their own, but in many respects, conducting activities on their own. There's probably a little bit of analogy to the way that stocks are traded these days, just purely on algorithms, and sort of the way that the SEC has basically designed its governance system around what machines do and what they're allowed to do. But to answer your question a little bit differently, I think that a lot of it is really going to depend on whether we're talking about healthcare or defense systems and weapons, or our educational system. And a lot of it is really going to come down to what is it that we're seeking to regulate AI with. And that is going to be a committee by committee process. That usually means it's going to be clunky. And that's where I think that, back to your initial question, with the majority leader kind of bringing everybody in and trying to understand what the issue sets are. And then I think from what I've read, having committees work on how AI will intersect with their subject matter jurisdiction. I mean, it sounds kind of nerdy and like time consuming, but that's the only way to get bills passed. And I think that each committee is going to have to look at whether do we actually need something signed into law to effectively deal with the types of innovation and risks and opportunities associated with AI capabilities in this space, or is it better punted to an executive or regulatory agency or an international governance type standard, or just best practices in the industry, or hands off, let the private sector figure it out? I would predict that we're not going to get it right every step of the way. That's never been done in the course of human history, where we always get everything right. But it's going to require a lot of input from a lot of people, subject matter experts, in agriculture and manufacturing, and you name it, the automotive industry, whatever it is, as well as those who are technologists by training.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, do we need to kick it over to federal government? And so, Sorel, I wanted to ask your opinion on this particular issue around soft law, hard law, but essentially also the trends that you're seeing in the federal government and how they're starting to grapple with this AI regulation issue. In addition to kind of what you're seeing trend-wise, maybe some thoughts on the companies that have put together, or that the Biden administration announced had put together some standards and voluntary standards that they're adhering to.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I'll see if I can get to all of it. I think that one of the key things from my perspective is that voluntary commitments just are not enough, right? I think that we have not seen companies just agree to do the right thing in all cases. And, we've been through this before with social media. We don't need to make those same mistakes again with AI. And so, I hope that we really can start to see some higher levels of expectation, through law and regulation. And some of that is already starting to happen, right? So you were sort of asking, what are we already starting to see from this administration? And as I was sort of mentioning before, there are already a lot of agencies that are in the process of doing rulemakings. As Miriam was mentioning, there was this historic joint statement from the enforcement agencies pointing out that a lot of their regulatory power does already include AI. If anyone would like to read an actually entertaining government document, there have been some really brilliant blog posts put out by somebody from the FTC talking about the way that the FTC's existing power does also include, keeping AI snake oil and other types of issues from, hurting the public. And so I think that those are all really positive steps. I think that, what you also see in that is an interesting and important mix of sort of sector specific approaches, right? So, HHS thinking about healthcare algorithms, of course, right? We all want to make sure that people with healthcare expertise are involved in those decisions. And then you're also seeing cases like the FTC thinking about, where is it appropriate to have cross-cutting guidance? And I think we're going to need both the sector-specific and the cross-cutting approaches. And I think that they're going to need to have some teeth, right, to make sure that companies actually live up to it. I think also setting that type of floor, that type of lower bar for what's expected of companies also helps them, right? Because then it takes some of that competitive pressure off if you know that everyone's going to be required to do this.
For sure. And Rob, I know you've got some thoughts on this in terms of your current position, but also what you've done before in the State Department. What are your thoughts on kind of the trends you're seeing in, volunteer versus hard law versus soft law?
Yeah, I think as we look at this question of what kind of law is required, the baseline we need to think about is where companies are today. I can speak for the 80 multinational tech companies that are ITI members, and they're focusing on explaining that how their systems work. They're telling people when they're interacting with an AI system, especially disclosing that an AI system is they're interacting with systems affecting health, safety, or an important human right. They're putting out model cards or fact sheets that explain the features and limitations of models. So the private sector has a huge incentive to build that trust to increase adoption. They're also doing things like creating ethics councils. So I think you need to look at where the industry is, and then also the potential burden on small businesses who might have to meet larger paperwork burdens, and also those that are research and experimenting who could be swept up in any number of regulations. So it's really important that regulation be focused on the highest risk use cases, specific use cases. And then, as Miriam was explaining before, there's a number of existing laws that apply. And those also include things like tort law, product liability law. Really, AI is a form of software, and anybody using software today has to abide by generally applicable laws. So we need to think about where those gaps are, do a horizon survey before enacting new laws in particular ways. And then I say this also, of course, is not a way of saying we shouldn't do something in the United States. We should have a pro-innovation framework that manages risk, because from the international perspective, we need something to lead with. We need to be for something. And that's where I think a conversation between the private sector, civil society, Congress, and the administration can come together on that construct of what we're for. Now, regulation can be part of that, but I think it also recognizes the technical capabilities that the tech sector can provide, a number of these areas, including disclosure, but also a number of other things that need to happen, other people in the conversation, including digital literacy when it comes to concerns about deepfakes and other things. So there's a whole number of constituencies and multi-stakeholder process that needs to occur to develop a smart US policy.
And Tom, do you mind if I just add one
Please.
more point to underscore? When we're saying everyone needs to be bought in, a lot of our work at Equal AI is working with companies who are bought in. They want to be responsible AI users. And so we have to align on what our best practices. And part of the challenge now is we don't have clear national or international standards, but part of the challenge is it requires an internal framework. It requires an internal commitment. One of the practices, we have a white paper coming out any second that's co-authored by several of our members, where they align on some best practices. You have to have accountability. You have to have senior level buy-in. It doesn't happen if you don't have that. You have to have standard measures, and they have to be well articulated across your enterprise so that everyone knows what's being tested when, what to flag and to whom, and you have to have a routine cadence for testing. So the reason I say the individual actors and companies is because all the regulation will not get buy-in from companies who really have to do this internal work given the technology we're dealing with.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that point. And I do want to get to some of the questions that the audience had. So we have about 5 minutes left, and obviously we could keep talking about this, and I would love to. The hour has flown by, but I want to make sure that we have a couple questions addressed here, and this is generally for the group. We've addressed some of them, so I might expand it out a little bit. But one question is, should we require something like an environmental impact assessment before an AI application is released, an opportunity to assess the risks, bias, impact, in a sense, expand the nature of the amount of testing that's required? So open to anybody who wants to respond to that.
No, it's unworkable.
Okay, impact assessment's unworkable. Anybody else?
I would say they're totally workable. And in fact, there's many places that already do them as a routine matter, of course, right? And absolutely, we should require those. And I would also say we should require those, and they should be associated with enforcement, right? So we need to make sure that companies are actually living up to an appropriate duty of care in terms of how they are, what they're doing after they potentially find a problem from an impact assessment.
Yeah.
So if I could add,
go for it, Rob.
I was going to say it really would need to be targeted and risk-based, because there's one standard for an autonomous vehicle or something in healthcare, and there's a totally different standard for predictive text or a simple application that's using some kind of artificial intelligence in the background, not using it for decision making or even a recommendation authority. And then I think separate from that, you do need to recognize what's already going on. Some companies are already doing impact assessments, but it's fitting their particular niche. Every type of application probably would need to have a different type of impact assessment. There's no universal, and because there's no standards for robustness, for security, for bias at this point, it's really hard to know what you'd be meeting in one of those standards. It's really helpful for the private sector to know what the standards are they're supposed to be meeting in that type of assessment.
So I'm hearing a no, a yes, and more detail needed on the impact assessments across.
And we vote yes.
And then another yes. So a question about generative AI in Section 230. So thoughts on whether generative AI is covered under Section 230. And if not, I have my own thoughts on that. What potentially could be used in place to limit liability?
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Tom.
Well, this is just, off the cuff, but, I do not think that generative AI essentially from a platform would be covered under Section 230. But if a user were to take something that was produced generative AI from a platform and post that onto a platform, that would be covered under Section 230 and liability protection. So little a, little b.
Good answer.
All right. So the other one, and then we only have a couple more minutes, and this is a really meaty one. How do you regulate global AI? Is it through cloud-based development? We talked a little bit about this. But then if it's cloud-based development, how do you address anything that is, outside the US jurisdiction? Are there any examples we could use here?
I can start. I think that we got to recognize that with the open sourcing of models and the cloud-based nature of computing power, which is decreasing probably 70% a year, there's going to be tools for AI in the hands of anyone in the world. So it's more like use of cyber tools, which can be used for good or bad. They're tools. So we need to have ways internationally to go after the true malicious actors who are using it for cyber attacks or using it for fraud, just as we have in the area of cybersecurity. We have to build coalitions to go after those bad actors, get nations to adopt normative frameworks to go after the worst of actors. And then I think beyond that, the better actors are going to do generally the right thing, but there are ways that they can adhere to global standards for risk management. And we need to keep pushing people there. But this narrow sliver of malicious actors are ones that are going to be difficult to deal with. They're not going to operate by the rules that we set.
last 20 seconds. Anybody want to add to that? No? Okay, so I think with that, I'll go ahead and start closing out the program. I want to thank the panelists very much for joining us today and having all the questions that they've fielded, not only from myself, but also from the audience members. We will try to respond to your, if you were an audience member who posed a question, we'll try to respond offline. But again, thank you so much to everybody who joined, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.